You are going to die. That is the most inevitable truth of your life. And yet, you do everything you can to forget it. You live as if you have endless time, as if you could keep putting off who you are, what you feel, and what you need to change. But you can't, and maybe that is exactly what makes life valuable. Because if everything were eternal, nothing would carry weight, nothing would feel urgent, nothing would be truly precious. Death does not make life meaningless. Death makes life matter. You are going to die, and that is not a bad thing. What would be bad is never understanding what that truth has to teach. Death is not only the end of life, it is also what gives shape to life while it is happening. That may sound harsh at first, but think about it carefully. If we had infinite time, why would we choose now? Why would we love with urgency, ask for forgiveness today, or start that project this year? The possibility of death turns time from an abstraction into something precious. It is not death that empties life of meaning, but the fantasy of living forever that would make everything easy to delay, loose, and weightless. Limits do not destroy the value of things. Many times, they are exactly what creates that value. Seneca understood this with remarkable clarity. In On the Shortness of Life, he does not say that life is short in itself, but that we waste it. That is an important shift. The problem is not only the number of years, but the way we let them slip away in distractions, empty ambitions, lingering resentment, and activities that seem important but steal the soul. When Seneca says that it is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a lot of it, he is forcing us to face an uncomfortable truth. Death may not be the greatest thief of life. Many times we are. And we only realize that because deep down, we know our time has an end. That awareness changes everything. It forces us to make distinctions. What deserves my attention? What really matters? What am I putting off as if I had guarantees that no one actually has? Seneca sees wisdom as the art of using time well, because time is the only thing that, once lost, never comes back. Money can be recovered. Reputation can be rebuilt. Mistakes can be corrected. But a day lived without presence, direction, or truth disappears forever. In that sense, death is not only a future event. It is already working now, quietly, by turning every hour into something that cannot be recovered. Heidegger takes this reflection to an even more radical level in Being and Time. For him, human beings almost always live on autopilot, buried in routine, in what everyone does. We work, consume, repeat habits, follow other people's expectations, and keep pushing our own life further ahead. That later is the great illusion. Heidegger draws attention to the fact that we are finite beings, beings toward death. That does not mean living obsessed with the end, but understanding that death is the most personal, most unavoidable, and most non-transferable possibility we have. No one can die for us, and that is exactly why no one can live for us. When that truth really hits us, something wakes up. Automatic life loses its charm. Excuses become weaker. A person realizes they cannot keep living according to other people's script forever and still call that an authentic existence. Heidegger does not treat death as a sad detail at the end of the journey, but as something that can pull the individual out of distraction and return them to themselves. Facing finitude is a way of stopping a half-lived life. Whoever runs from death also runs from the responsibility of choosing their own life. Whoever faces it begins to understand that every choice leaves other possibilities behind, and that it is exactly this limit that makes choice serious, beautiful, and real. The Buddhist tradition reaches a similar conclusion by another path. In the teachings on impermanence, everything that exists is temporary. Bodies, emotions, relationships, seasons, joys, pains, possessions, identities. Nothing stays fixed. Suffering increases when we try to freeze what is, by nature, in motion. Death, then, does not appear as some abnormal event in the universe, but as an expression of the most basic law of existence. Everything passes. Buddhism does not invite us to look at this with despair, but with clarity. What is impermanent does not become worthless. On the contrary, it becomes worthy of deep attention. A flower that withers is not less beautiful because it does not last long. A meeting is not less valuable because it ends. A happy season of life does not lose its importance because it cannot be kept forever. Impermanence gives things delicacy. It makes the moment stop being ordinary. When Buddhism teaches us to contemplate transience, it is not teaching coldness, but presence. Whoever accepts that everything changes begins to hold on less and live more. They begin to love without the illusion of possession, to give thanks without demanding permanence, to breathe in the present with greater wholeness. Death stops being a betrayal of reality and becomes part of the very texture of reality. This is where Seneca, Heidegger, and Buddha, despite being so different, meet. All three reject the idea that thinking about death is morbid. For all of them, it is forgetting death that makes us shallow. When we try to banish it from awareness, we fall into endless delay. We think there will always be another chance to apologize, another phase to start really living, another moment to say what matters. And so we keep dragging life forward as if the clock were decoration and not a silent sentence. Death interrupts that fantasy. It forces us to admit that life is not a rough draft. And maybe that is exactly why life carries weight. A hug carries weight because it could be the last one. An honest conversation carries weight because there will not always be time to make things right. An act of courage carries weight because it has to be done now in the middle of fear, not in some ideal future that may never come. Finitude intensifies the value of the present. It turns ordinary life into something morally serious and existentially alive, not because everything has to be dramatic, but because everything is passing. To accept death as a limit is also to free life from indifference. It is to stop treating it like an endless supply. It is to understand that the beauty of existing lies exactly in the fact that existence does not last forever. That is why death does not ruin life. What ruins life is living as if it could be postponed forever. When we face finitude without running from it, something matures inside us. Urgency stops being anxiety and becomes clarity. Time stops being a background and becomes responsibility. And life, at last, stops being a promise and becomes presence. Epicurus tries to break down one of the deepest human fears with an idea that is almost shockingly simple. Death should not be feared because it is never experienced by the one who dies. In the letter to Menicius, he puts it in a decisive way. When we exist, death is not. And when death is present, we do not exist. This is not a word game. It is a serious attempt to heal a kind of suffering that comes less from reality and more from imagination. For Epicurus, the fear of death does not come from death itself, but from the mental stories we build around it. We suffer not because of something we actually feel, but because of something we anticipate, imagine, and enlarge inside the mind. This point matters because it completely changes the focus of the reflection. Epicurus is not saying that human beings do not feel anxiety when they think about death. He knows that fear is real. What he questions is whether that fear is rational. And his answer is no. Death, understood as the complete loss of sensation, cannot be an evil for the one who dies, because all good and evil depend on the ability to feel. There is pain only where there is someone to feel it. There is loss only where there is a consciousness experiencing that loss. If death is exactly the end of that ability to feel, then it cannot be suffering for the dead. The real suffering comes before it, in the expectation, in the image, in the anxiety that turns the future into torture in advance. That is why Epicurus treats philosophy almost like medicine for the soul. The task of thought is not to impress, but to free. And one of the great inner prisons is living haunted by something that will never be lived in the way we imagine it. Many people do not fear death as non-existence, but as a kind of mental spectacle. The void, the darkness, the loss of everything, the tearing away of the self. But for Epicurus, that language already contains a mistake. It projects experience where there will be no experience at all. Fear creates scenes, but those scenes belong to the living, not to the dead. The mind suffers by trying to picture its own absence, and in that attempt, it creates an imaginary suffering that starts to weigh on life as a whole. Lucretius, the great intellectual follower of Epicurus, develops this view powerfully in On the Nature of Things. He sees that the fear of death is one of the deepest roots of human restlessness. Because of it, people cling desperately to fame, power, and wealth, as if they could build some kind of symbolic protection against finitude. They live in agitation, competition, and dissatisfaction, not only because they want more, but because deep down they are trying to escape a fate they do not accept. The problem is that the more they try to run from death through accumulation or vanity, the less they actually live. The fear of death does not only disturb the end of life, it poisons the present. Lucretius uses a brilliant line of reasoning to weaken that fear. Before we were born, we passed through an immense stretch of non-existence, and that caused us no suffering at all. We do not grieve the time before our birth. We do not experience it as a tragedy that we were not here 100 years earlier. So why should we think the state after death is terrible, if it is of the same kind? The symmetry is unsettling. We accept peacefully the non-being that came before life, but we rebel against the non-being that will come after it. For Lucretius, that difference reveals not a rational truth, but an emotional attachment to the self. That attachment feeds the fantasy that death harms us. But harms whom? That is the question the Epicurean tradition keeps asking. If someone says, "Death is terrible because it takes away everything I love," Epicurus would answer that this deprivation only seems terrible while it is being imagined by someone who is still alive. After death, there is no subject left to suffer that loss. This does not mean life loses its value. It means exactly the opposite. Life should be valued while it is being lived, without being distorted by panic over its end. For Epicurus, the wise person does not want to live forever, nor do they despair because life is limited. They seek to live well, with calm pleasure, friendship, simplicity, and clarity. This is where an essential difference appears between Epicurean pleasure and the common caricature of hedonism. Epicurus does not recommend excess, reckless escape, or constant distraction. He understands pleasure, in its highest sense, as the absence of disturbance in the soul and the absence of pain in the body. And there is no real peace when a person lives under the constant terror of death. That is why overcoming this fear is not some small theoretical detail. It is a condition for a lighter life. Someone who constantly fears death can hardly rest. They are always chasing impossible guarantees, always trying to control what cannot be controlled, always postponing peace until later. Epicurus's philosophy tries to cut that anxiety at the root, but that does not make his reflection cold or inhuman. On the contrary, there is something deeply compassionate in telling someone they do not need to carry an imaginary burden. A large part of human suffering comes from suffering the same thing many times, first in the mind and then in reality. Epicurus realizes that, in the case of death, many people suffer only in the mind, because death itself will never be felt as the horror they imagine. Thought creates an enemy that cannot be fought, because it is made of shadows. The cure, then, is not in conquering death, but in correcting the false image we create of it. This also changes our relationship with time. The person who stops seeing death as a constant threat can return to living the present more fully. Instead of being haunted by the end, they begin to pay attention to the quality of the life happening right now. Epicurus shifts wisdom away from the future and back to the present. The question is not, how do I avoid dying? But how do I live without being tormented by what is not in my control? This change may seem small, but it reorganizes a whole life. A person stops wasting themselves on the idea of the inevitable and starts caring for what can actually be lived. Friendships, thoughts, simple pleasures, and inner peace. In the end, the strength of Epicurus lies in showing that the fear of death is often a suffering without a real object, sustained by projections of consciousness. And Lucretius deepens that insight by showing how this fear distorts our ambitions, our desires, and even our idea of happiness. For this tradition, death should not be romanticized or dramatized. It should be understood with sobriety, not as a metaphysical monster, but as the point where sensation, pain, and consciousness come to an end. And maybe there is something freeing in that conclusion, because when we stop fearing death as an experience of horror, we also stop giving it the power to rule our lives. For the Stoics, remembering that you are going to die is not an exercise in sadness. It is an exercise in clarity. The famous memento mori, remember that you are mortal, was not created to make life feel heavier, but to keep it from being wasted. In this tradition, the reminder of death works like a kind of inner cleansing. It cuts away excess, exposes vanity, and brings sharp focus back to what truly matters. Instead of creating paralysis, it creates direction. Instead of feeding despair, it disciplines the soul. This view may sound strange today, because many people connect any reflection on death with pessimism or morbidity. But the Stoics saw it in the opposite way. For them, the problem is not thinking about death, but forgetting it. When a person lives as if time were guaranteed, they become careless with their own existence. They put off important conversations, hold on to ridiculous resentments, give themselves over to endless distractions, and treat their days as if they could always be renewed forever. Forgetting death creates disorder. Remembering death, on the other hand, gives seriousness back to the present. Seneca insists on this in his letters to Lucilius and also in On the Shortness of Life. In different ways, he keeps repeating that life is not necessarily short, but that our way of living makes it small. We spend too much energy on what does not matter. Let our minds be taken over by useless worries, and behave as if we own time that does not belong to us. For Seneca, wisdom begins when a person realizes that each day is already being taken from their account. This is not about panic, but about moral accounting. Anyone who knows time is limited begins to ask more honestly, what am I spending my life on? That question changes everything, because for the Stoics, time is not just duration. Time is the material of existence. It is what life is made of. When someone wastes hours on envy, shallowness, or constant irritation, they are not simply losing time in some casual sense. They are handing parts of their own life over to things unworthy of it. Seneca sees this as a quiet form of slavery. So the reminder of death works like an antidote. It forces the individual to see that every delay has a cost, and that every useless attachment consumes something that can never be recovered. Marcus Aurelius, in Meditations, brings this principle into the heart of daily practice. He does not write as someone trying to theorize about death from a distance, but as someone using it to correct his own character. Again and again, he reminds himself that he could leave life at any moment. And the point is not to scare himself, but to use that truth as a standard for acting better now. If death can come at any moment, then why act with pettiness? Why give in to pride? Why turn small offenses into endless dramas? Awareness of finitude shrinks the ego and deepens responsibility. There is something very beautiful in the way Marcus Aurelius treats this subject. He does not write like a desperate man, but like someone trying to align himself with reality. For him, Death is part of nature. Just as everything that is born changes, we too are subject to change and to an end. To rebel against, that would be as pointless as rebelling against the seasons. The real task is not to deny mortality, but to live with dignity inside it. And that means fulfilling the human role well, acting with justice, moderation, courage, and awareness. Epictetus, in turn, offers perhaps the most practical version of this inner discipline in the Enchiridion. His whole philosophy revolves around one essential distinction. There are things that depend on us and things that do not. Death clearly belongs to the second group. We do not control the moment, the form, or the certainty of the end. What we do control is our attitude toward that fact. For Epictetus, suffering over what does not depend on us is a form of inner disorder. The wise person does not try to control the inevitable. They try to govern their opinions, judgments, and reactions. That is why, in Stoicism, remembering death is not passivity, it is training. It is a way of strengthening the mind against illusions of control. Whoever accepts that they are mortal stops demanding from the world, guarantees the world never promised. And that acceptance, far from making life poorer, makes it more solid. The person stops living at war with reality. Instead of wasting energy trying to push away the inevitable, they begin to focus it on the only field that is truly theirs: character. The Stoic does not ask, "How do I avoid dying?" but "How should I live, knowing that I will die?" That change in the question is decisive, because it turns death from an abstract threat into an ethical tool. Memento mori stops being a dark phrase and becomes a principle of inner order. What deserves my attention today? What is important enough to be worth my limited time? What is so small that it should not take up even one more hour of my mind? When death honestly enters the horizon, many things lose their artificial shine. Social vanity, ridiculous arguments, resentments carried for years, all of it starts to look smaller than it once seemed. At the same time, other things gain depth. The right words said at the right moment. A reconciliation that can no longer be delayed. Integrity preserved even without applause. True presence in an ordinary conversation. The Stoics teach that finitude does not lower everyday life. It consecrates it. Because if each day could be the last, then each action stops being automatic. Everything begins to carry a quiet weight. Not the weight of anxiety, but the weight of importance. Of course, this attitude requires practice. No one becomes stoic just by agreeing with the idea that they are going to die. You have to train this thought until it stops being an abstraction and becomes a real standard for living. Marcus Aurelius did this by writing to himself. Seneca did it by examining how he used time. Epictetus did it by constantly remembering the limits of human control. In every case, the goal was similar: not to be caught unprepared by one's own superficiality. The Stoics understood something that still feels deeply true today. Human beings lose themselves when they live as if they have unlimited time. They become scattered, weak in the face of appearances, and easily trapped by the trivial. The reminder of death gives us back our center. It does not remove the pain of being finite, but it keeps that pain from turning into confusion. And maybe that is the great Stoic lesson. Memento mori is not meant to frighten us, but to put our priorities in order. It is not meant to darken life, but to strip away what is false. Whoever remembers that they are going to die does not necessarily live in sadness. It may be exactly the opposite. They live with more clarity, more sobriety, and more truth. At the heart of Buddhism is an idea that is as simple as it is hard to accept. Everything passes. Nothing that exists stays fixed, untouched, or guaranteed forever. Bodies change, emotions change, relationships change, desires change, seasons change, thoughts change. What seems solid today may already begin to fall apart tomorrow. To the ordinary mind, this is uncomfortable. We want stability, permanence, control. We want to hold on to what we love, freeze what gives us pleasure, and push away what threatens us. But in the Buddhist view, it is exactly this attempt to hold on to what is temporary that makes suffering worse. We suffer less not when the world stops changing, but when we stop demanding that it stay permanent. The Buddha placed this insight at the center of the spiritual path. Among the marks of existence, impermanence, anicca has a decisive place. Everything that arises passes away. Everything that is born is transformed. Nothing conditioned remains exactly the same. This is not some abstract theory made for intellectual discussion. It is a direct observation of experience. All you have to do is look carefully. A strong feeling seems eternal while it lasts, but soon it weakens. Joy comes, blooms, and passes. Pain feels unbearable, but it also changes. Even the image we have of ourselves is always moving. Buddhism begins when a person stops treating this truth like a detail and recognizes that it shapes life itself. The problem is that our mind resists. It clings to pleasure as if it could make it stable and rejects pain as if it could remove it forever. In doing that, it creates a war against reality. In Buddhism, suffering does not come only from pain itself, but from the way we relate to the flow of things. We want what feels good to last longer than it can. We want what feels bad to disappear before its time. We want people, phases of life, relationships, and even versions of ourselves to remain the way they are when they comfort us. But reality never signs that contract. Impermanence breaks it again and again. That is why the Buddhist acceptance of transience is not passive resignation. It is clarity. The Dhammapada insists in many passages on the need to wake up to the fragility of everything that is made of parts. The distracted person clings to the world as if it could offer final stability. The awakened person sees that everything is moving, and because of that, learns to live with less illusion. This does not mean loving less, feeling less, or taking part less in life. It means giving up the impossible demand that what is temporary should behave as if it were eternal. When that demand weakens, something inside us softens too. Our relationship with loss changes. Our relationship with aging changes. Our relationship with death changes. From this point of view, death is not a flaw in the world, as if something had gone wrong in the way existence works. It is an extreme expression of what has always been present in everything, the fact that nothing remains. What we call death is not some shocking exception inside an otherwise stable reality. It is the continuation of a law that already shows itself in every breath, every ending, and every quiet change in body and mind. Nagarjuna deepens this vision in Mahayana Buddhism through philosophy. In his reflection on emptiness, he shows that things do not have a fixed and independent essence. They exist depending on causes, conditions, relationships, and names. This is true for objects, for events, and also for what we call the self. Attachment becomes so painful precisely because we treat as solid what is actually dependent and changeable. We want to hold on to identities, possessions, relationships, and even our own personal continuity as if there were some unmoving core there. Nagarjuna breaks down that illusion, and in doing so, he does not destroy the value of life. He weakens the rigid way we cling to it. This is an important shift. Many people think that accepting impermanence would make everything cold or meaningless, as if nothing mattered because nothing lasts. Buddhism points in the opposite direction. Things matter precisely because they do not last. The delicacy of a moment is tied to the fact that it cannot be held onto. The beauty of a presence is tied to the fact that it cannot be possessed. When we stop demanding permanence, we begin to see the value of the moment more clearly, not because the moment is everything in some shallow sense, but because it reveals the true texture of existence, arising, changing, disappearing. Dogen, in Zen Buddhism, takes this understanding to an almost poetic depth. In texts from the Shobogenzo, he insists that time and being are not separate things. To exist is already to be in time, and to be in time is already to be in transformation. There is no fixed self moving through outside changes. We ourselves are that process. This breaks apart the fantasy of a solid identity being threatened by an unstable world. For Dogen, life itself is this movement. To fight against, it is to fight against the structure of reality. Awakening is not escaping impermanence, but fully living within this flow without being crushed by the illusion of permanence. This view has a deeply practical result. We suffer less when we stop saying, "This should not change," and start asking, "How can I relate to this change without destroying myself inside?" Buddhism does not promise that pain will disappear. Loss will still hurt. Goodbyes will still be hard. The body will still be vulnerable. But there is a difference between unavoidable pain and suffering made worse by mental resistance. When the mind stops fighting the temporary nature of life, it finds space for a more mature kind of peace. Not the peace of someone who controls everything, but the peace of someone who no longer demands from the world what it never promised to give. And this also applies to happiness. A person who accepts impermanence does not panic as much when something beautiful happens, because they do not try to trap it. They appreciate it more. They are more present. Instead of turning joy into possession, they turn joy into a lived experience received with gratitude. It is a subtle change, but a huge one. Attachment says, "This has to last." Wisdom says, "This is here now." Attachment turns beauty into anxiety. Clarity turns transience into depth. For Buddhism, impermanence is not a dark sentence, but a key to freedom. What traps us is not the fact that everything passes. It is our refusal to accept that everything passes. Death enters this horizon not as an error, punishment, or metaphysical scandal, but as the continuation of a truth already present in every part of existence. Everything changes. Everything flows. Everything falls apart and comes back together. And maybe there is less despair when we stop asking life for what it cannot give, absolute permanence, and begin receiving from it what it actually offers: presence, transformation, and the chance to awaken in the middle of what passes. In Taoism, wisdom does not begin by trying to conquer nature, but by learning not to place yourself against it. And that completely changes the way death is seen. In many traditions, death appears as a rupture, an absolute tragedy, or a metaphysical problem to be solved. In Taoism, especially in Laozi and Zhuangzi, death is viewed in a less dramatic and more cosmic way. It does not appear as a scandal in the fabric of reality, but as a transformation within the flow of nature itself. From this perspective, the human mistake is not only that we die, but that we resist the natural course of things so much that we turn our own finitude into permanent anxiety. The Tao Te Ching, associated with Laozi, teaches again and again that a wise life is one that aligns itself with the Tao, the way, the silent principle through which all things arise, change, and return. The Tao is not a personal being or a rigid doctrine. It is the deep movement of reality, the rhythm by which the universe is ordered without needing violent force. Whoever lives out of step with this flow becomes tense, artificial, and hardened. Whoever learns to follow it finds a kind of peace that does not depend on controlling everything. And it is exactly there that death stops looking like some absurd invasion and begins to be understood as part of the natural return of all that exists. All of nature teaches this all the time. The seasons change without asking permission. Day dissolves into night. Water flows because it does not try to be stone. Leaves are born, mature, dry out, and fall. Nothing is shocked by transformation except the human being. When the ego decides it, should somehow be exempt from it. Taoism sees that resistance as a source of unnecessary suffering, not because loss does not hurt, but because the desire to freeze the flow of life creates a second kind of pain, the pain of fighting the inevitable. Anxiety grows stronger when we demand that the world stay stable in order to protect our need for permanence. Laozi deeply values softness, flexibility, and the ability to yield without breaking. Water is one of his best-known images precisely because it does not resist in a rigid way and yet moves through everything. That image helps explain the Taoist attitude toward death. The wise person does not ignore the end, but also does not treat it as a personal insult to the desire to remain. He recognizes that everything alive takes part in a greater cycle, in which appearing and disappearing are not absolute opposites, but moments in the same current. What is born is already in the process of changing. What changes is already taking part in a return. Death, then, does not interrupt the order of nature. It confirms it. Zhuangzi develops this sensitivity in an even more radical and literary way. In his writings, human attachment to rigid divisions, life and death, gain and loss, success and failure, is constantly exposed as a limitation of the ego's narrow perspective. For Zhuangzi, the problem is not only that we suffer because we die. We suffer because we insist on looking at reality through fixed categories, as if transformation were a mistake. In one of his best-known passages, when speaking about the death of his wife, he rejects ordinary mourning and explains that she passed through a series of transformations, from non-being to form, from form to life, from life to death. To cry as if death were an absolute catastrophe would be, for him, to fail to understand the natural process in which all of us take part. At first glance, this may seem cold, but it is not. Taoism is not asking for emotional indifference. It is proposing a wider perspective. Pain is real. Longing is real. Separation touches the human heart deeply. But there is a difference between feeling pain and turning pain into a metaphysical revolt against the course of reality. Zhuangzi tries to ease exactly that revolt. He suggests that peace begins when we stop demanding that life obey our attachment and begin to see that each individual form is a temporary expression of something larger, wider, and more fluid than our desires can contain. That is why detachment in Taoism does not mean coldness, the denial of human bonds, or a rejection of life's value. It means not trying to possess what is, by nature, already moving. It means loving without the illusion of total control. It means living without turning every change into a threat to identity. The ego wants to fix, hold, and secure. The Tao flows. When we try to live only from the ego, every sign of change feels like loss. When we learn to take part more deeply in the flow of the Tao, change stops being only destruction and begins to be seen as continuity in another form. This idea has very deep practical consequences. Resisting aging, the ending of cycles, the vulnerability of the body, and the certainty of death, as if all of that were some kind of abnormality, creates inner tension. A person lives as if at war with the structure of the world. They seek total safety, total permanence, total control, and they fail because reality was not made to satisfy that kind of demand. Taoism invites a different posture, less control, more harmony, less rigidity, more trust in the process, less domination, more participation. That does not remove the mystery of death, but it keeps that mystery from being automatically translated into terror. There is also a very strong philosophical humility in this tradition. Taoism distrusts the human urge to explain everything, dominate everything, and force reality into the categories of the intellect. Death, then, does not need to be fully solved in concepts in order to be lived with greater peace. Maybe it is enough to realize that human life is not outside nature, as if we were exceptions to the universal law of change. We are part of it. Our bodies, our rhythms, our beginnings and endings belong to the same movement that governs rivers, trees, winds, and seasons. Anxiety appears when we want to be more fixed than the world itself. Peace begins when we accept being part of it. That is why, in Taoism, dying is not the collapse of a project of control, but the continuation of a flow from which we were never truly separate. Laozi and Zhuangzi do not offer cheap comfort. They offer a change in posture. Instead of facing death with rigidity and horror, they propose a broader relationship with change. Instead of turning finitude into an offense, they invite us to see it as transformation. And maybe that is the great Taoist wisdom. Suffering less does not depend on escaping the natural cycle, but on stopping the fight against it. Death is not a metaphysical scandal, but a return, a passage, a bend in the course of nature. And whoever learns to flow with that course, instead of resisting it all the time, finds a peace that does not deny finitude, but weaves it into the very art of living. For Heidegger, death is not just a biological event that brings life to an end at the end of the road. It is a structural truth of human existence. In being in time, finitude does not appear as a sad detail we prefer to leave for later, but as something that already accompanies every way of existing. We are not beings who first live and only later, by accident, die. From the very beginning, we are beings thrown toward our end. And it is precisely this condition that can pull us out of superficiality. For Heidegger, the awareness of death is not meant to destroy us from within, but to wake us up. It breaks the hypnosis of automatic living. This point is essential because Heidegger believes that most people live immersed in what he calls inauthentic existence. That does not mean a false life in a moralistic sense, as if everyone were hypocrites all the time. It means something more subtle and more disturbing. In general, we live according to the impersonal, according to what one does, what one thinks, what everyone considers normal. We follow routines, ready-made opinions, social expectations, inherited goals, manufactured desires. We work, consume, distract ourselves, repeat habits, and almost never stop to ask whether we are really inhabiting our own life. Existence ends up being guided by a kind of collective autopilot. It is in this context that death takes on a radical philosophical role, because nothing breaks the comfort of impersonal life as much as the real awareness of one's own finitude. In everyday life, death is usually treated as something that happens to other people. Someone dies, the news passes, a funeral happens, and soon social life rearranges everything so the discomfort can be pushed aside. The world keeps functioning, and we cooperate with this silent conspiracy to keep death at a distance. Heidegger sees this as a form of escape, not just escape from death, but escape from oneself. Because by treating death as something distant, general, and external, we avoid recognizing that it is the most personal possibility we have. This expression is central in being in time. Death is the human being's own most certain and indeterminate possibility. It is most personal because no one can die in my place in the existential sense. Others may suffer with me, stay beside me, or even sacrifice themselves for me in other ways, but my death still belongs to me in a radical way. It is certain because no other possibility in life is as unavoidable. And it is indeterminate because, although we know it will come, we do not know when. This combination creates a unique tension. Death is absolutely certain, but always uncertain in its timing. And when that tension is truly faced, it can shake the illusion that there will always be a later. This is exactly where awareness of finitude becomes freeing. As long as a person lives as if they had unlimited time, they allow themselves to delay everything essential. They delay courage, delay truth, delay change, delay facing themselves. They tolerate empty relationships, meaningless work, and habits that slowly destroy them inside, because it always seems like there will be a later. Heidegger shows that this later is a form of existential anesthesia. When death enters the horizon in a serious way, it breaks that fantasy. It forces the individual to realize that life is not an endless supply. And when that realization matures, the person can begin to choose more authentically. For Heidegger, authenticity does not mean becoming eccentric or original in some shallow sense. It is not about inventing a rare personality or living in constant rebellion against the world. To be authentic is to take one's existence as one's own. It is to stop living only according to what others expect and to face the fact that no one can decide for me what my life means. Death plays a central role here because it individualizes. In the middle of the crowd, routine, and impersonal talk, it is still possible to hide. But in the face of one's own finitude, that hiding place starts to weaken. A person realizes that their existence cannot be outsourced. Heidegger also speaks of anxiety as a fundamental experience in this process. Anxiety is not the same as fear. Fear always has an object. Fear of losing something, fear of a situation, fear of a person, fear of an event. Existential anxiety is deeper and more diffuse. It pulls us out of the familiar comforts of daily life and reveals the nothingness we try not to think about. In that state, the ordinary world loses its appearance of absolute solidity, and the individual finds themselves face to face with the strangeness of existing. It is uncomfortable, without a doubt, but it is also revealing, because anxiety breaks the illusion of safety built by automatic life. It opens space for an existence that is less asleep. Death, when thought about authentically, should not be confused with a morbid obsession. Heidegger is not suggesting that a person should live in terror, counting the days, or sinking into despair. What he proposes is a clear-eyed relationship with finitude. The expression, being toward death, does not mean fixation on the end, but the understanding that life only truly becomes mine when I accept that it is finite. Death works as a horizon that gives weight to our choices, because to truly choose is always to give up other possibilities, and only a finite being chooses seriously. An infinite being could delay everything forever. A mortal being has to answer no. That answer does not come in ready-made formulas. Heidegger does not offer a moral manual telling us what choices to make. He offers something more demanding, a call for each person to consciously inhabit their own existence. That means listening less to the noise of the impersonal and more to the quiet demand of what truly matters. It means realizing that time is not a neutral background, but the very texture of our being. It means recognizing that living is not just going through the days, but taking responsibility for being who we are under the unavoidable shadow of the end. Heidegger's philosophy of death is a philosophy against numbness. It fights the life lived through inertia, distraction, and conformity. By reminding us that we are finite, it does not push us into nihilism, but into intensity. Not theatrical, dramatic, exaggerated intensity, but the sober intensity of someone who understands that life is not a rehearsal. Whoever runs from death also runs from themselves, because they run from the one perspective capable of tearing down every excuse. But whoever faces it can begin to live authentically, not because they conquered finitude, but because they finally stopped hiding from it. And maybe it is exactly in this hard encounter with limit that existence stops being automatic and finally begins to become real. Montaigne begins with an uncomfortable but deeply freeing insight. Much of our cowardice in life comes from the fear of death. Not only the final moment, but the idea of it, the shadow of it, the possibility of it. In his essays, he draws on an ancient tradition, especially Cicero and the Stoics, to defend a claim that may seem severe at first, but is surprisingly human. To philosophize is to learn how to die. And this does not mean training the mind for sadness. It means, above all, weakening the power that the fear of death has over our decisions, our desires, and our inner peace. Whoever has never seriously thought about death ends up living under its rule. Whoever learns to look at it directly begins to live with more freedom. Montaigne writes about death not as a distant theorist, but as someone trying to heal a very concrete human weakness. The fear of death follows us because it seems like the absolute blow, the end of plans, relationships, the body, identity. The problem is that when this fear settles in without reflection, it contaminates all of life. A person starts acting less out of conviction and more out of self-preservation. They avoid necessary risks, delay the truth, cling too tightly to comfort, and turn existence itself into an anxious attempt to push away the inevitable. Instead of living well, they live afraid of losing. Montaigne sees this as a form of slavery. That is why thinking about death, for him, is an exercise in inner freedom. Whatever we refuse to imagine grows in the dark. Whatever we look at often loses some of its power to dominate us. Montaigne wants to take death out of the territory of silent terror and bring it into the field of reflection, not to make it trivial, but to break the spell. As long as death remains a taboo surrounded by fantasy, it rules us from a distance. Once it is examined, named, and reflected on, it stops being some undefined monster. Thought does not erase finitude, but it corrects the disordered imagination that makes it even more oppressive. This attitude connects directly with the classical tradition Montaigne admired, especially Cicero. In the Tusculan Disputations, Cicero also treats philosophy as a remedy for the soul's deepest fears, including the fear of death. The influence is clear. The purpose of thought is not only to build abstract systems, but to form a stronger spirit in the face of what cannot be avoided. Cicero helps shape the idea that death only becomes tyrannical when the mind sees it as the greatest evil. If it is placed back within the natural order of things, if it is thought about with sobriety, its hold over the soul weakens. Montaigne inherits this attitude and gives it a more intimate, more personal, more existential tone. What makes his approach so powerful is that he does not defend an artificial, theatrical, almost inhuman kind of courage. He knows that human beings shake, hesitate, and cling. He knows no one gets rid of fear by command. But that is exactly why he insists on slowly becoming familiar with the idea of death. Instead of pushing it out of awareness, he proposes making it a philosophical companion, remembering that we are mortal, not to sink into sadness, but to break apart illusions. The main illusion is the idea that there will always be more time. That illusion weakens character because it gives permission for endless delay. We delay conversations, decisions, reconciliation, and necessary change. We live as if there were an endless supply of days. Awareness of death breaks that false comfort. So learning how to die is also learning how to put things into perspective. Many worries that seem enormous in everyday life reveal how small they are when seen in the light of finitude. Minor offenses, vanity-driven conflicts, empty ambition, the excessive need for approval. All of that loses some of its importance when we remember that we are temporary. Montaigne is not preaching contempt for ordinary life, but a refinement of vision. What really deserves our energy? What is worth wearing out the soul for? What are we defending so intensely that deep down has no real substance? Death, when thought about philosophically, becomes a measure of proportion. At the same time, it intensifies the value of what truly matters. Relationships gain more depth. Honesty becomes more urgent. The present stops being just an interval and becomes something precious. Montaigne sees that only those who accept their own mortal condition can fully live without so much distraction. That is because finitude brings us back to what is concrete. Instead of living in the fantasy of an endless future, we are called to live now with more presence and less postponement. Death, paradoxically, does not steal life. It wakes it up. By reminding us that we are not unlimited, it forces us to ask how we want to use the little time we have. There is also an ethical dimension to this reflection. The fear of death makes people easier to manipulate. Anyone who fears losing their life or comfort too much can become submissive, dishonest, or cowardly. They may give up dignity in order to preserve security. Montaigne understands this clearly. Learning how to die is also learning not to sell yourself so easily for a few more years, a little more protection, or some illusion of safety. A person who has made some peace with the idea of death becomes less controlled by panic, and that creates a rare kind of freedom, the freedom to act with greater integrity. This is not an absolute or heroic kind of freedom in some fantasy sense. It is a human freedom, imperfect but real. The freedom of someone who no longer lives only to avoid the end. Because when life is organized entirely around escaping death, it becomes smaller. A person may still keep breathing, working, and planning, but they do all of it under a defensive logic. Instead of living, they protect themselves. Instead of choosing, they hide. Instead of growing, they preserve themselves. Montaigne wants to break that logic. He knows death will come either way, and that the great mistake is to hand over the rule of our days to it in advance. That is why his formula is so powerful. To philosophize is to learn how to die, not because thought should separate us from life, but because only by facing death in thought can we lessen its tyranny over life. The goal is not to love death, desire death, or romanticize finitude. It is not to be a slave to fear. It is not to let the inevitable destroy what is still alive. It is to cultivate a soul that can look at the end without completely losing its peace. Montaigne's lesson is less dark than it seems. Learning how to die is, in truth, learning how to live without being ruled by fear. It is taking away death's power to contaminate every choice, every bond, every step. It is understanding that finitude does not have to produce only terror. It can also produce clarity. And maybe that is the great philosophical dignity of human beings, to know that they are going to die, to think seriously about it, and even so to choose to live with more lightness, more courage, and more truth. Schopenhauer begins with a hard but deeply revealing insight. Much of human suffering comes from the way the individual clings to the self, not only to its desires, plans, and fears, but to the quiet belief that this self is the absolute center of reality. In the world as will and representation, he describes human life as being driven by an endless force, the will, which is never fully satisfied. We desire, we achieve, we become frustrated, and we begin again. And at the center of this movement is the ego, always wanting to continue, possess, affirm itself, and preserve itself. That is why death appears as something so unbearable. It humiliates exactly this image of centrality. But maybe, for Schopenhauer, there is an unexpected comfort in that. Death frightens the ego, yes, but it can also free us from the obsession with the self. This idea does not come from a simple contempt for individuality, as if Schopenhauer were saying that the person means nothing. The point is more subtle. He sees that the empirical self, the one that takes itself as a separate, fixed, and absolutely important entity, lives in constant tension. It wants to last, wants to win, wants to be recognized, wants to control the world around it. And for that very reason, it suffers. It suffers because it wants too much, compares too much, and fears too much. The ego wants permanence in a world marked by change. It wants security in an existence shaped by loss. It wants endless continuity in a body destined to wear down. Death, then, seems like the great catastrophe because it violently tears apart this fantasy of centrality. But Schopenhauer wants to show that this fantasy was already fragile from the beginning. The individuality we defend so strongly may not be the deepest truth of what we are, but only a temporary form of expression. Influenced by Indian traditions, especially the Upanishads, he moves away from the idea that the isolated individual is the ultimate core of reality. Behind the multiplicity of beings and consciousness, he sees a more fundamental unity, the will, this blind, universal force that expresses itself in all living beings. That means what we call the self is not a separate sovereign kingdom cut off from everything else, but a temporary arrangement within something larger. In this context, death does not destroy an absolute center. It dissolves one particular form. That is exactly what makes his reflection both ambiguous and powerful. On one hand, Schopenhauer is known for his pessimism, for emphasizing suffering, dissatisfaction, and the painful repetition of desire. On the other hand, there is in his philosophy a kind of metaphysical relief. Maybe the drama of the ego is not the final drama of reality. Maybe the individuality that fears disappearing so much is already, in some way, part of the illusion that sustains suffering. Attachment to the self makes pain worse because it makes us interpret everything through the logic of possession and threat. My future, my image, my continuity, my loss. Consciousness spins around itself until existence becomes a field of anxiety. Death breaks this circle in a brutal way, but it also reveals that the ego was never as sovereign as it imagined. This view has very clear echoes of Buddhism, even though Schopenhauer does not repeat the Buddhist tradition in a literal way. There is a deep connection in the criticism of attachment and the suspicion toward the solidity of the self. Suffering grows when the mind fixes itself on rigid identities and endless desires. The individual believes that they must protect their particular form at any cost, and so they live at war with impermanence. Schopenhauer recognizes in this struggle one of the main engines of human misery. The more the self wants to affirm itself as the center, the more it exposes itself to pain, because everything threatens it: time, failure, comparison, aging, illness, death. The ego lives under siege because it wants to preserve what, by nature, cannot be preserved forever. That is why death can be thought of not only as loss, but also as unmasking. It shows the individual that their subjective importance does not match the structure of the universe. The world does not revolve around my personal continuity. That hurts pride, without a doubt. It hurts the narcissistic imagination that wants to remain untouched. But there is also something freeing in this humiliation. Not being the center of the universe may hurt the ego, but it can bring relief to the soul. Because if the self is not this absolute fortress that must preserve itself all the time, then maybe we can live with less rigidity, less desperation, and less obsession with our own permanence. Schopenhauer also finds comfort in aesthetic experience and in compassion, and that helps explain his view of death. In aesthetic contemplation, especially through art, the individual for a few moments becomes detached from the prison of wanting. They stop seeing everything only through the filter of personal interest and experience a kind of stillness. In compassion, something similar happens. The barrier between self and other becomes less absolute, and the suffering of another person is recognized as something that concerns me too. In both cases, the tyranny of the ego weakens. And that suggests that the deepest relief is not found in endlessly satisfying the self, but in putting it in perspective. Within this view, death appears as the final blow against the ego's attempt to make itself eternal as the center. Of course, Schopenhauer does not turn this into easy celebration. There is no romanticizing of death. Fear exists because individuality clings to its particular form and resists disappearing. But philosophy can create a critical distance from that fear. It can ask, what exactly is terrified? What is trying to remain? And why do we assume that this individual form is the whole truth of being? These questions do not erase the discomfort of finitude, but they weaken the illusion that death destroys something absolute. Deep down, Schopenhauer forces us to face something the ego hates to hear. Maybe our individuality is not the center of everything. And paradoxically, That can be good news, because the obsession with the self is exhausting. It turns life into constant defense, constant comparison, constant dissatisfaction. Death humiliates this obsession by showing that the individual is not the master of time, or of existence, or of permanence. But for that very reason, it can also open space for a strange and serious kind of freedom, the freedom of not having to keep up the fiction that everything revolves around us. That may be Schopenhauer's most unsettling lesson. The ego fears disappearing because it confuses its own form with the totality of reality. But if that form is already only a passing appearance, then death is not only the destruction of what matters, it is also the dissolution of an illusion that was feeding suffering. Not being the center of the universe hurts pride, but it may heal part of our anxiety. And so death, without becoming any less hard, takes on an unexpected philosophical meaning. It does not only bring the drama of the self to an end, but reveals that this drama may never have been the true center of everything. Nietzsche does not answer death with easy comfort, spiritual escape, or promises of safety. His philosophy is far more demanding. In the face of mortality, he does not ask how to escape the end, but how to say yes to life, even while knowing that it is fragile, uncertain, and limited. That is why his reflection remains so powerful. For Nietzsche, human greatness does not lie in denying death, softening its image, or hiding it behind comforting illusions. The strongest response to finitude is something else, to affirm life as a whole, with its beauty and its pain, with its peaks and its abysses, with everything in it that is temporary. In that sense, accepting death can become part of a great yes to existence. This already appears in the gay science, where Nietzsche fights against everything that weakens the power to live. He deeply distrusts worldviews that turn this life into a mere hallway to another one, as if the here and now were only preparation for some truer beyond. For him, this kind of thinking often comes from an inability to endure the hardness of reality. Instead of facing life as it is, the human being invents metaphysical shelters, transcendent justifications, and promises of future compensation. The problem for Nietzsche is that this often weakens our relationship with concrete existence. Whoever lives waiting for redemption outside life runs the risk of never fully inhabiting life itself. Death enters exactly at this point. It is one of the most decisive facts of the human condition, and also one of the hardest to accept without falling into denial. But Nietzsche does not want that denial. He wants a more radical kind of courage, the courage to look at finitude without turning it into an argument against life. Death exists, suffering exists, loss exists, and even so, life can still be affirmed. That word is central, affirmed. Not tolerated with resignation, not endured with bitterness, not lived as a sad obligation, but affirmed with inner strength. Nietzsche's question is not, how do I protect myself from the tragedy of existence? But how do I become strong enough not to need to lie about it? In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, this appears in the figure of the creator of values, the one who does not simply react to suffering with resentment. Nietzsche hates resentment because it turns pain into moral poison. Instead of admitting that life is hard and creating greatness within it, the resentful person begins condemning existence, reversing values, glorifying weakness, and calling their own powerlessness a virtue. Mortality can feed exactly that kind of reaction. The individual realizes they are going to die and concludes that everything is absurd, everything is unjust, everything is unworthy of love. Nietzsche rejects that conclusion. For him, the highest test of spiritual strength is not turning finitude into an excuse to hate life. This is where the idea of amor fati, love of fate, gains its depth. Even though the phrase appears more clearly in other works, it helps summarize his posture very well. Loving fate does not mean superficially liking everything that happens, as if pain stopped hurting. It means something harder, not wishing that the basic structure of existence were different. not wanting to erase suffering at the cost of also erasing intensity, risk, uniqueness, and the beauty of real life. Whoever loves fate does not say yes only to what feels convenient. They say yes to the whole of experience, including the fact that everything is finite. This acceptance is not passive. Nietzsche is not preaching submission to the world. On the contrary, he values creation, self-overcoming, and the ability to turn one's life into a work of art. But that creation is only noble when it begins from reality, not from escape from reality. Death is part of that reality. Knowing that we are going to die should not push us into sterile despair, but into a life that is more intense, more whole, and less cowardly. Finitude can act like a challenge. What are you doing with the time you have? How do you respond to the fact that your existence will not be endless? Do you use that fact to hide, complain, and blame the world, or to live in a higher way? Nietzsche seems to say that the worst response to death is the shrinking of life. It is living small because you are afraid of loss. It is becoming too cautious, too obedient, too weak, out of fear of suffering and fear of the end. The person who lives like that tries to preserve themselves, but at the cost of reducing their own power. Instead of becoming more alive, they become more protected. And for Nietzsche, that price is too high. Life should not be measured only by its length, but by the strength with which it is affirmed. A long life lived in resentment, timidity, and spiritual cowardice is worth no more than a life lived with intensity and courage. Death, then, is not only a limit. It is also a measure. It reveals what we are doing with our own passage through the world. It is impossible to talk about Nietzsche and mortality without remembering eternal recurrence, presented in a decisive way in the gay science. The question is devastating. What if you had to live this same life, exactly this one, infinitely many times? Every pain, every joy, every mistake, every loss, every moment repeated forever. The point is not cosmological at first, but existential. It tests the depth of your affirmation. Would you curse that repetition? Or could you say yes? The force of this idea lies in pushing the individual beyond resigned acceptance. It is not enough to endure life. The challenge is to love it enough not to wish it were different. Seen from this angle, death stops being only what threatens life and becomes part of what makes life affirmable as fate. Because a life without end, without risk, without loss, without conclusion, might also be a life without intensity. Finitude is not some external detail. It takes part in the very way value emerges. There is urgency because there is limit. There is courage because there is vulnerability. There is greatness because there is the possibility of falling. Nietzsche does not idealize pain, but he knows that an existence sterilized of everything that wounds would also be sterilized of everything he admires: creation, strength, transformation, and self-overcoming. In the end, his philosophy does not offer us anesthesia against death. It offers something rarer, an ethic of strength in the face of death. The highest response to mortality is not to say, life would be good if death did not exist, but to affirm that life, precisely because it is finite, can be lived with more intensity, more truth, and more courage. Accepting death, then, is not bowing to nothingness, but refusing the lie. It is giving up the hope for an existence without wounds, so that we can love this concrete, tragic, and beautiful existence. Maybe that is the most Nietzschean gesture of all. Not asking life to be less harsh before it deserves our love, but loving it enough not to turn its harshness into an argument against it. Death is still a limit, of course, but the strong spirit does not turn that limit into a sentence. It makes it part of its own yes. And that is exactly where Nietzsche becomes so provocative. To affirm life despite death is not to live as if the end did not exist, but to live knowing that it does, and still choosing not to retreat from existence. Schopenhauer treats death in a way that directly wounds human pride. For him, the terror we feel in the face of death does not come only from the loss of biological life, but from our deep attachment to the individual self. What panics is not just the body that wants to stay alive. It is also the consciousness that has grown used to thinking of itself as the center of reality. In the world as will and representation, and in works like Parerga and Paralipomena, Schopenhauer insists that this self we cling to so tightly may not be as solid as we imagine. And that is exactly why death, although frightening, can also have a revealing philosophical meaning. It shakes the illusion that our individuality is the measure of all things. This idea begins with the basic structure of his philosophy. Schopenhauer distinguishes between the world as representation and the world as will. As representation, the world appears to us divided into objects, individuals, bodies, and events separated in space and time. This is how ordinary consciousness sees reality. Me here, the other person there, each being isolated in its own form, struggling to preserve itself. But behind this multiplicity, Schopenhauer sees something deeper, the will, a blind, endless, universal force that shows itself in all living beings. The individual, then, is not the ultimate foundation of reality. It is a particular appearance, a local expression of this larger force that already completely changes the way death is understood. For ordinary consciousness, dying seems like an absolute disaster because the self sees itself as a final and definite entity. It feels unique in the most exclusive sense of the word. It wants to keep being exactly this individual, with this memory, this name, this way of being in the world. And everything that threatens the continuity is experienced as a catastrophe. The ego wants to remain. It wants to extend its desires, its attachments, its self-image. It wants to be the exception to the universal rule of transience. That is why the fear of death is also the fear of the dissolution of what we call the self. But Schopenhauer forces us to ask, is this self you cling to so desperately really such a solid substance? His answer is deeply uncomfortable. No, this self is not as absolute as it seems. What each person calls I is trapped within the forms of representation: time, space, causality, memory, body. It is a conditioned, phenomenal individuality, not the ultimate truth of being. The problem is that we identify so strongly with this passing form that we begin to treat it as essence. All of our suffering is organized around this belief. We want to protect the self, affirm the self, satisfy the self, make the self eternal. And so we live under siege from anxiety, because everything threatens this fiction of permanence: aging, failure, rejection, loss, illness, death. This is where the echoes of the Upanishads and Buddhism appear strongly in Schopenhauer's philosophy. In those traditions, he found a powerful criticism of the centrality of the ego. The insight that empirical individuality does not exhaust what we are, and that attachment to it makes suffering worse, is very close to his own thought. Of course, Schopenhauer reworks this inside his own system, without repeating Indian doctrines literally. Even so, the connection is clear. The basic human mistake is to take as absolute what is only a passing form. From this angle, the individual self is not a metaphysical throne, but a temporary configuration. The fear of death grows because we confuse this configuration with the center of being. In Parerga and Paralipomena, Schopenhauer returns to this theme many times in a more direct, almost therapeutic tone. He tries to weaken the panic around death by showing that what disappears is empirical individuality, not necessarily what is most fundamental in being. The individual fears annihilation because he thinks of himself as the whole. But that self-interpretation is already an illusion. Death strikes the individual phenomenon. Yes, the particular form in which the will objectified itself in that body, that consciousness, that life path. What it humiliates is the self's claim to be the center of the universe. And that humiliation, though painful, can also be freeing, because there is a deep exhaustion in living as a servant of the ego. The self always wants more security, more recognition, more time, more control. It is never fully satisfied, because its very structure is based on lack. It desires and suffers. It gets something and desires again. It compares, competes, fears loss, fears not being enough, fears disappearing. Schopenhauer sees in this the dynamic of the will operating within the individual, an endless impulse that turns existence into restlessness. Death then appears as the final blow against this personal machine. The self panics because it feels it is going to lose everything. But philosophy asks, maybe losing this imaginary center is not only destruction. Maybe it is also the dissolution of an illusion that was producing suffering. That does not mean Schopenhauer romanticizes death. He knows the instinct for self-preservation is powerful, that the body resists, that individual consciousness clings to life. His philosophy does not erase the pain of attachment. It tries to understand it. The fear of dying is not ridiculous. It is the natural expression of an individuality that takes itself to be absolute. What philosophical reflection can do is introduce some critical distance into that fear. It can show that the anxiety does not come only from the brute fact of death, but from the interpretation the ego gives to it. What is terrified is the self that wants to keep being the sovereign point of reference for everything. And maybe that self was, from the beginning, less real than it assumed. This conclusion also has an important ethical implication. When the individuals stop seeing themselves as the absolute center, their relationship with others changes. Compassion, which is so central for Schopenhauer, is born precisely from the weakening of the rigid barrier between self and other. If we are all expressions of the same deep will, then the suffering of others is not something completely foreign. The obsession with self-preservation loses some of its tyranny, and that softens not only life, but death as well, because death stops being seen only as the destruction of a private throne, and starts being seen as the dissolution of an individual form that was never the whole. Schopenhauer forces us to face a truth the ego hates. The individuality we defend so fiercely may be only a temporary appearance within a much larger reality. Death is frightening because it threatens that appearance, because it takes away from the self the impossible promise of permanence. But at the same time, it reveals something decisive. Our empirical identity is not the center of the universe, nor the ultimate foundation of being. What dies is the individual figure that said "I" with so much urgency. And that realization, hard as it is, can be strangely comforting. Maybe the comfort is not in guaranteeing that the self will remain intact, but in realizing that its disappearance does not destroy something absolute. It only dissolves a limited form to which we had given too much importance. Death, then, stops being only the enemy of individuality and becomes also a philosophical revelation about its limits. It exposes the ego's pretension, weakens the illusion of centrality, and opens a wider perspective on what we are. And maybe that is exactly where Schopenhauer's philosophy, even in its darkness, offers a strange kind of freedom, the freedom of no longer having to defend so desperately the fiction that the self is everything. Tolstoy realized with rare force that death does not always frighten us only because it brings life to an end. Many times, it frightens us because it shines a cruel light on the way we have lived. In the death of Ivan Ilyich and A Confession, he shows that terror in the face of death can come not only from losing the future, but from the devastating suspicion that the past was wasted. In that sense, the fear of death is not only the fear of disappearing. It is also the fear of the inner judgment that the nearness of death brings. Sometimes we are not afraid only of dying, but of realizing too late that we never truly lived. That is the tragedy of Ivan Ilyich. At first glance, his life seemed proper, respectable, even enviable. He built a career, followed social conventions, kept up appearances, and pursued comfort, status, and recognition. He did everything that, in the eyes of the world, looked like success. But when death begins to draw near, the whole structure loses its solidity. What once looked like order reveals itself to be empty. The choices he made according to what was socially acceptable no longer offer any real comfort. What Tolstoy exposes so brutally is that a life that looks successful on the outside can be spiritually bankrupt on the inside, and death has the power to tear off that mask. Even Ilyich's suffering does not come only from physical pain or the fear of biological death. It comes from the growing feeling that he lived falsely. Not false in the sense of a conscious lie, but false in a deeper way, removed from what truly matters. He followed the expected script, adjusted himself to the world, pursued what was convenient, elegant, and proper. But at the decisive moment, he realizes that maybe none of that was ever real life. The question eating him alive is not only, am I going to die? But what if all of this was wrong? That is the crisis of meaning that Tolstoy turns into the dramatic center of the work. There is something deeply disturbing in this, because it touches a universal weakness. Many people can live with the abstract idea of death as long as it seems far away. The real shock comes when finitude begins to measure the quality of existence. Suddenly, it is not enough to have lived many years or to have collected certain outward signs of success. A more radical question appears. Was there any truth in it? Was there real love? Was there presence? Was there moral courage? Or was there only adaptation, habit, vanity, and fear? Tolstoy sees that death becomes especially terrifying when consciousness begins to suspect it has lived only on the surface. In a confession, this question becomes even more direct, because now it is no longer about a fictional character, but about Tolstoy himself facing a devastating existential crisis. He had achieved fame, literary recognition, social prestige, and material stability. He had everything that, in theory, should justify life. And yet he was seized by a destructive question. What for? What is the meaning of all this in the face of death? If everything ends, if I and everything I built disappear, why go on? Tolstoy's crisis is not only emotional, it is philosophical and spiritual. He realizes that society's usual answers are not enough when death enters the scene seriously. The hardest point in a confession is that the emptiness does not come from a lack of success, but from its insufficiency. Tolstoy already had what many people consider desirable, and even so, he felt the collapse of meaning. That makes his reflection especially powerful, because it destroys the illusion that fear of death will be solved by outer achievement. Money, prestige, talent, social approval, none of that guarantees peace in the face of finitude. When death arrives as an inner question, it does not ask how much you accumulated, but what was holding your life together from the inside. Tolstoy discovers painfully that much of what society calls a full life may not survive that test. That is why, in Tolstoy, death works as a revelation. It reveals the fragility of conventions, the emptiness of appearances, and the poverty of a life organized only around social success. Even Ilyich lived according to what was supposed to be lived, but not necessarily according to what was true. That contrast is devastating, because shallowness does not always look shallow while we are still inside it. Many forms of alienation present themselves as normal life. A person works, consumes, organizes the house, takes care of their image, fulfills duties, seeks advancement, and all of that can create the feeling of a life in order. But death, for Tolstoy, has the power to ask, order for what? In the name of what? That question does not condemn ordinary life or demand some kind of dramatic heroism. What Tolstoy denounces is not the simplicity of everyday life, but its falsification. The problem is not having routine, work, or responsibilities. The problem is living in such a way that the soul becomes secondary to outside expectations. Even Ilyich does not fail because he did not accomplish great heroic things. He fails because, deep down, he let the value of his life be defined from the outside in. And when the end comes, that borrowed life no longer offers any shelter. At the same time, Tolstoy does not stop at accusation, especially in the spiritual ending of Ivan Ilyich and in the search of a confession. There is the suggestion that the nearness of death can also open a path toward truth. Suffering is not automatically redemptive, but it can tear through the layer of self-deception. When social justifications collapse, something more essential can appear: the need to live with sincerity, compassion, and real meaning. In Ivan Ilyich, this appears in the late realization of love, care, and the falseness of much of what surrounded him. In Tolstoy's own life, it appears in the search for a life less grounded in prestige and more connected to a moral and spiritual dimension. This turn matters because it keeps the reflection from becoming purely hopeless. Tolstoy shows that death can be a crisis of meaning, but also a test of truth. It destroys illusions, and that hurts. But maybe it is better to have illusions destroyed than to die without ever realizing you lived under them. The problem is not only that life ends, it is that life may end before it was ever truly embraced. That is Tolstoy's central anguish, and maybe one of the most human of all. The fear of the end mixes with the fear of having existed only halfway. His literary philosophy of death is a call to inner seriousness. Not a sad, rigid, or theatrical seriousness, but the seriousness of someone who understands that life should not be measured only by appearance, convention, and success. In Tolstoy, death forces the human being to answer for themselves, and that answer cannot be given with titles, elegant furniture, or public approval. It demands something more stripped down: truth. Maybe that is why Tolstoy still hits us so hard, because he shows that the crisis in the face of death often does not come only from love of life, but from the suspicion that we have lived far from what matters most. And that suspicion hurts more than the end itself. Sometimes the real horror is not only dying, but discovering too late that what we called life was nothing more than a neatly arranged sequence of distractions, conventions, and fear. Kierkegaard understands that death is not just a biological fact that brings existence to an end. It is also a force of revelation. When human consciousness realizes that it is finite, vulnerable, and unable to control its own destiny, something deep begins to move inside. This experience can create despair, fear, and dizziness. But for Kierkegaard, it can also open a path to inwardness that a superficial life could never reach. Death exposes human fragility, no doubt, but precisely because of that, it also reveals our spiritual and ethical dimension. It forces us to ask not only how much time we have, but who we are in the face of finitude. In The Sickness Unto Death, Kierkegaard describes the human being as a tense synthesis: finite and infinite, temporal and eternal, necessity and possibility. The problem is that this synthesis is rarely in balance. The human self is not something ready-made and stable. It is a task, and that is exactly why despair appears. For Kierkegaard, despair is not just intense sadness or emotional collapse. It is a deeper disorder in the relationship the self has with itself. A person can despair because they do not want to be who they are, because they want to be only an idealized version of themselves, or even because they live so distracted that they do not even notice their own despair. In this context, death works like a shock that can break that unconsciousness. As long as life remains numbed by habits, distractions, obligations, and social roles, a person can avoid certain basic questions. They can live as if they were just another piece in the machinery of the world. But the awareness of death interrupts that comfort. It pulls the individual out of the illusion of stability and shows that existence is not a secure possession. Everything can fall apart. Everything is fragile. And in that moment, a person may be pushed into a confrontation with themselves. Kierkegaard sees that this confrontation is painful because it reveals how much less solid our identity is than we imagine. The self that once seemed well-adjusted begins to shake when it realizes it stands before a limit. This is where anxiety appears, one of the central ideas in his philosophy. For Kierkegaard, anxiety is not simply fear of something specific. Fear has an object: fear of getting sick, fear of losing someone, fear of failure. Anxiety is deeper and more open. It comes from freedom, from possibility, from the fact that the human being is not completely fixed in a finished essence. We are beings who can choose, can fail, can lose themselves, can be transformed. When death enters this horizon, anxiety grows stronger because human freedom comes face to face with its own limitation. We may choose many things, but we cannot choose not to be finite. This tension between freedom and finitude opens an inner abyss. But Kierkegaard does not treat this abyss only as a tragedy. He also sees it as an opportunity for truth. A life without anxiety might be too shallow, too mechanical, too spiritually asleep. The anxiety of death has the power to tear through the illusions under which a person has been living. It shows that we are not absolute masters of time, the world, or even ourselves. And this discovery, though humbling, can lead to a kind of depth that comfort never produces. Only someone who feels the radical instability of existence can begin to seek life in a more serious, more honest, and more inward way. In Fear and Trembling, Kierkegaard explores this inwardness through the figure of Abraham. Although the book does not deal with death only in an abstract philosophical way, it enters into a lived experience where ethics, faith, fear, and surrender reach maximum tension. Abraham stands before the possibility of losing what is most precious to him, and his journey reveals something essential in Kierkegaard's thought. Human life is not exhausted by the outer level of social rationality. There is an inward dimension in which the individual stands alone before the absolute. Death, or the extreme possibility of loss, reveals this spiritual solitude. And it is there that a human being may be challenged to make a leap. The so-called leap in Kierkegaard is not crude irrationality, nor an irresponsible rejection of thought. It is the recognition that certain existential truths cannot be solved only through calculation, system, or objective guarantees. Human beings want total security, but existence does not offer that. They want final proof, but life demands decision before full certainty is possible. The awareness of death intensifies this condition. In the face of finitude, there is no philosophical system that removes the risk of existing. The existential leap is the response of someone who accepts that to live is to commit without absolute control. It is a movement from pure observation to personal involvement. That is what makes Kierkegaard's reflection especially powerful. He does not allow death to be treated as only an intellectual topic. It has to be internalized. It has to touch the way the individual lives, chooses, loves, believes, and takes responsibility. Finitude is not only an outer limit. It reveals the seriousness of existence. If we are going to die, then our choices matter in a radical way. Not because we can control the end, but because we are called to answer for our life before it comes. In this sense, death gives weight back to the ethical. It forces us to ask, how am I living? What truth am I standing on? Am I only distracting myself, or am I really existing? Kierkegaard also understands that many people run from this confrontation. Society offers countless ways of dispersing ourselves. Social roles, conventions, entertainment, ambitions, and even empty religious language can work like anesthesia. Very often, the individual would rather dissolve into the crowd than face their own uniqueness in the presence of death. But that escape has a price. Whoever avoids anxiety may also avoid depth. Whoever runs from finitude may also run from their own inner calling. Life may become more comfortable, perhaps, but also more superficial. That is why death in Kierkegaard has an almost educational character. It teaches through disturbance. It does not offer quick comfort. It does not give cheap peace. Instead, it forces the soul to mature. Human fragility, once recognized, can become the beginning of spiritual seriousness. A person stops believing so naively in their own self-sufficiency. They become more aware of dependence, responsibility, and the weight of choice. Death wounds pride, but it can also purify vision. Kierkegaard shows that despair in the face of death does not have to be the final stage. It can be a passage. Finitude can throw the individual into vertigo, but it can also pull them out of an empty life and lead them into a more authentic relationship with themselves, with ethics, and with the absolute. Death reveals that we are fragile, yes. It reveals that we do not control what matters most, that our existence is precarious, and that the self is not a stable fortress. But for that very reason, it also reveals that living is a spiritual task, not just a biological one. Maybe that is Kierkegaard's most singular strength, showing that the anxiety of death is not simply something to eliminate, but something to pass through. Because when finitude breaks our illusions and leaves us without guarantees, it also opens the possibility of a deeper, more responsible, and more truthful life. Not a life without fear, but a life that no longer uses fear as an excuse to remain asleep. In the Confucian tradition, the decisive question about death is not what exactly happens afterward, but how are you living right now? This shift is deeply important. Instead of centering wisdom on metaphysical speculation that can pull people away from their concrete responsibilities, Confucius turns attention to present moral life. Death exists. Finitude is unavoidable. But precisely because of that, the central issue becomes the quality of our conduct while we are here. In other words, the dignity of a finite life does not depend on solving every mystery of the universe, but on living with integrity, humanity, and responsibility in the time we have been given. This attitude appears clearly in the Analects. In one famous passage, when Confucius is asked about death, he says something like, "If you do not yet understand life, how can you understand death?" This response should not be read as contempt for the subject, but as a reordering of priorities. Confucius sees that human beings often search for grand answers about the unseen while failing in what is visible, immediate, and ethical. They want to understand the soul's final destiny, but neglect their duties toward parents, friends, community, and their own character. Confucianism rejects that escape. Before trying to master the beyond, one must learn how to live decently in the here and now. That does not mean death is irrelevant. On the contrary, finitude gives moral life its weight. If human existence is limited, then every gesture matters more. Every word, every choice, every relationship carries a particular seriousness. Time is not endless, and because of that, virtue cannot be postponed forever. Respect cannot be pushed off until later. The cultivation of character cannot be treated like some optional detail. In this view, mortality does not destroy the meaning of life. It concentrates it. It makes human life something to be understood not only in terms of duration, but as an opportunity for moral formation. Confucius is far less interested in making abstract claims about what happens at the end of existence than in forming people capable of living with Ren humane benevolence and with Lai, the rightness expressed in flari, conduct, ritual, respect, and the proper order of relationships. This is decisive. For him, human greatness does not lie in escaping the finite condition, but in honoring it through conduct. The way we treat others, the way we respond to family responsibilities, the way we preserve integrity in everyday life, all of this matters more than speculation that does not transform character. Death enters as a quiet horizon that makes this task more urgent, more serious, and more beautiful. There is something deeply sober in this view. Many philosophical traditions try to overcome the fear of death by offering a comforting metaphysical explanation or an ontological structure. That softens the finality of the end. Confucianism goes in another direction. It seems to say, maybe what matters most is not removing all uncertainty about death, but not wasting life trying to escape it through theories that do not make anyone better. Wisdom lies less in possessing final answers, and more in living in such a way that finitude is not a cause for moral shame. The greater problem is not dying, but dying without having cultivated what makes human life worthy. This is where Mencius deepens and enriches the Confucian inheritance. For him, human beings have basic moral tendencies, seeds of virtue that need to be cultivated. Compassion, justice, a sense of respect. The ability to discern ethically all of this is part of a human nature that can either flourish or be distorted. Finitude makes this cultivation even more meaningful because each human life is a concrete but limited opportunity to realize that moral potential. We are not here merely to last, compete, or accumulate. We are here to become fully human. This emphasis changes the way mortality is seen. Instead of asking only how much time we have, the Confucian tradition asks, what are we becoming in that time? The value of life is not measured only by its length, but by its moral elevation. A long life without integrity is not necessarily admirable. A finite life guided by honesty, respect, and benevolence leaves a more lasting ethical weight than many empty years. Death, in this sense, does not automatically erase the value of a life. What remains is not the body, of course, but the moral legacy written into relationships, memory, and the change one brought into the lives of others. This point is essential in the Confucian world. The person is never understood as an isolated individual. Human life happens within a web of relationships, family, social, political, ritual, emotional. Finitude, then, is not just a private biological destiny. It makes even more important the way we place ourselves within this network of relationships. Honoring father and mother, acting with loyalty, exercising authority with justice, treating others with respect, all of this gains depth because time is short and relationships are fragile. A finite life calls for moral delicacy. It calls for attention. It calls for ethical presence. That is why Confucianism gives so much value to the idea of legacy, though not in the vain sense of personal fame. True legacy is not being remembered as someone grand in a spectacular sense, but having lived in such a way that the moral order was strengthened by your presence. A just person leaves marks that go beyond death because they formed, guided, inspired, and cared for others. Their value did not lie in giving brilliant theories about death, but in having lived in a way that made their life a source of dignity for others. Finitude makes this more moving. Precisely because no one remains forever, what each person plants in the little time they have matters even more. This sobriety also contains a kind of antidote to metaphysical anxiety. A human being can lose themselves trying to force final answers out of the universe about things that may go beyond their condition. Confucius prefers to bring them back to the field of moral action, not as some poor limitation, but as practical wisdom. There is something deeply mature in accepting that not everything will be made theoretically clear and still living with integrity. Dignity does not depend on mastering the mystery. It depends on not using mystery as an excuse for moral negligence. Beyond that, this view offers a particular kind of comfort. If death is unavoidable, then maybe the question is not how to defeat it in thought, but how to make sure it does not empty life of its value. And the Confucian tradition answers that by saying life is fulfilled in the practice of virtue. Whoever has lived with integrity, humanity, and a sense of duty does not erase death, but faces it differently. Not because they solved every metaphysical puzzle, but because they did not waste existence in moral disorder. There is a specific kind of peace in that, knowing that finitude did not prevent a worthy life. Confucius and Mencius teach that the great question in the face of death is not only what will come after, but what kind of person am I being before it comes. That shift in focus is powerful. It brings philosophy back to the ground of concrete life, where parents grow old, friendships require loyalty, responsibilities demand firmness, and character is tested in small acts. Death remains a mystery, but life stops being treated like an abstract rehearsal. It becomes a field of moral formation. So this is the great Confucian lesson about finitude. More important than explaining death in metaphysical terms is living with dignity while one is still here. Because finitude gives weight to virtue, to relationships, and to moral legacy. And when life is lived in that way, the fact that it ends does not erase its greatness. On the contrary, it makes that greatness even more human, more moving, and more necessary. In the Bhagavad Gita, death does not appear only as a biological end that must be feared or avoided at all costs. It is placed within a much broader vision of being, action, and the meaning of life. That is what makes the text so powerful. On the battlefield, Arjuna collapses at the thought of killing and dying. His body trembles, his mind wavers, his will weakens. He is not only afraid of physical death, but of the moral and spiritual disorder that seems to come with it. And it is exactly in this moment of crisis that Krishna begins to teach him. The great question of the Gita is not only what happens when the body dies, but how a person should live, act, and remain faithful to duty in the face of finitude. Krishna answers Arjuna by radically shifting the horizon of the discussion. According to the Vedantic tradition that runs through the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads, the human being is not reduced to the perishable body. The body is born, grows, ages, and dies, but the deeper principle of being, the Atman, is not destroyed in the same way. The Gita insists that what is truly real in a human being cannot be cut, burned, soaked, or dried. This language is not only religious. It serves to free Arjuna from an absolute identification with the material level of existence. The body matters, concrete life matters, pain is real, but being is not exhausted by bodily form. This teaching, however, should not be understood as permission to despise earthly life. That would be a serious mistake. The Bhagavad Gita does not say, since the body dies, nothing here matters. On the contrary, the fact that death is placed within a broader spiritual vision does not weaken ethical responsibility. It deepens it, because if human life is not only passing matter, then the way we act in the world carries even greater weight. Krishna does not invite Arjuna to run from existential conflict, but to move through it with awareness, duty, and detachment. The problem is not simply dying. The problem is living in a cowardly, confused way, or living trapped by the ego. Arjuna's crisis feels so human because he wants to escape action in order to avoid suffering. He sees the horror of the situation and thinks that maybe the best option is to step back. But Krishna confronts him with an uncomfortable truth. Avoiding action is not necessarily moral purity. Sometimes it is just another form of attachment. Attachment to one's own peace, to one's own image of innocence, to the desire to escape the pain of making a difficult choice. The Gita teaches that a human being cannot avoid acting. Even refusal is already a choice. The decisive question, then, is not how do I completely escape pain and death, but how do I act justly in a world where pain and death exist? This is where the concept of dharma, duty, becomes central. For Arjuna, acting rightly does not mean following immediate emotional impulse, but recognizing the responsibility that belongs to him within the moral and cosmic order. Krishna's teaching is hard because it does not allow spirituality to become an escape. He does not tell Arjuna to abandon the world and hide in empty contemplation. He says, in essence, that wisdom must appear in action. A person must do what is theirs to do, not with selfishness or attachment to results, but with inner steadiness. Even when death is viewed spiritually, the practical lesson is still courage. This courage, however, is not brutality. It is not acting without feeling, nor hardening the heart. The courage of the Bhagavad Gita is born from a wider awareness of being. Whoever identifies only with the body and with immediate success will always be ruled by fear of loss. Fear of suffering, fear of failure, fear of death, fear of losing what they love. Krishna tries to lift Arjuna above that prison, not to make him indifferent, but to make him freer. When the self clings less to outcomes and to self-preservation as absolute values, it can act with greater clarity. Detachment, then, does not mean coldness. It means not letting ego and fear govern every decision. This point is one of the deepest in the Gita. Detachment is not the abandonment of action, but the purification of intention. Krishna teaches Arjuna to act without attachment to the fruits of action. That does not mean acting without responsibility for consequences, but acting without turning the result into the foundation of one's identity. A person does what must be done because it is right, not because it guarantees comfort, glory, or emotional security. This completely changes the relationship with death. Death stops being the great enemy that makes everything meaningless and becomes an unavoidable part of embodied existence. What truly defines the dignity of life is not avoiding the end, but living in such a way that the end does not find a soul ruled only by fear. The Upanishads echo this vision by insisting that the basic ignorance of the human being lies in confusing the deeper self with temporary forms. A person clings to the body, the name, the status, the place in the world, and then lives terrified of everything that threatens these outer layers. Death seems absolute because the individual has built identity on what is perishable. Spiritual wisdom does not erase the sadness of loss, but it offers another ground for existence. It invites us to recognize that there is something deeper than the shifting surface. And from that recognition, life can be lived with greater inner stability. At the same time, the Bhagavad Gita is deeply realistic. It does not offer Arjuna sentimental comfort. It does not say that believing in something higher will make everything easy. The teaching demands discipline, discernment, and inner transformation. It demands learning how to act in the world without becoming a slave to fear, vanity, and the refusal of suffering. That is very different from passivity. The wise person of the Gita is not someone who withdraws from life, but someone who takes part in it without being completely dominated by it. They act, love, struggle, endure loss, fulfill duties, but without reducing themselves to the drama of the ego. That is why the great philosophical strength of the Bhagavad Gita lies in joining metaphysics and practice. Death is interpreted within a broader vision of being. Yes, but that broader view is not meant to pull us away from concrete life. It is meant to teach us how to live it better. It reminds us that even in a universe where the body dies, we are still responsible for the quality of our actions, the steadiness of our character, and the clarity of our consciousness. Spiritual teaching does not replace ethics. It deepens it. In the end, Krishna does not give Arjuna a way out of mortality. He gives him something more demanding, a way to remain standing in front of it. The death of the body remains real. Pain remains real. Loss remains real. But none of these things has to lead the human being into paralysis or inner disorder. The greater question remains how to live. And the answer of the Bhagavad Gita is as ancient as it is alive: to live with courage in the face of the inevitable, with duty in the middle of confusion, and with detachment toward what the ego tries to possess forever. In Levinas, death stops being only an individual, private problem centered on the question, what will happen to me? This shift is one of the deepest and most disturbing parts of his philosophy. Instead of treating finitude only as the limit of my existence, Levinas pushes thought in another direction. Death also reveals the vulnerability of the other person, and the responsibility that this vulnerability awakens in me. In Totality and Infinity, and Ethics and Infinity, the decisive question is not only my relationship to the end, but the way human fragility calls me ethically. Death reminds us that human life is fragile, and that is exactly why it deserves responsibility and ethical attention. This perspective breaks with much of the philosophical tradition that treated death mainly as a problem of individual authenticity, personal anxiety, or the destiny of the self. Levinas does not ignore those dimensions, but he shifts the center of gravity. For him, the human being is not only an isolated consciousness facing its own end. First of all, the human being is someone exposed to the face of the other. And that face is not only a physical appearance. It is the presence of an otherness that speaks to me, unsettles me, and forbids me from reducing the other person to a thing, a number, a function, or a concept. The other appears as someone vulnerable, mortal, and irreplaceable. And it is exactly this exposure that grounds ethics. To think about death, then, is not only to think about my own future disappearance. It is to realize that before me stands someone who can suffer, be wounded, be abandoned, and die. That awareness changes everything, because when death is thought about only as an event in my own destiny, it can become just another chapter in the modern obsession with the self. My fear, my end, my anxiety, my authenticity. Levinas wants to break that closed circle. He wants to show that human mortality does not only isolate me inside myself, it obligates me to answer to the other. The fragility of life should not produce only introspection. It should produce responsibility. This point becomes even stronger when we remember the historical background of Levinas's work. His philosophy is shaped by the experience of a century marked by war, genocide, dehumanization, and systematic violence. He saw firsthand what happens when human life is no longer perceived in its singular fragility and instead gets absorbed into systems, ideologies, or totalizing projects. That is why his insistence on ethics is not abstract. When he speaks of the other, he is also speaking of the moral impossibility of treating another person as an available object. The death of the other is not a neutral fact. It is an ethical scandal. It is an appeal. It is an accusation against all indifference. In Totality and Infinity, Levinas criticizes the tendency of Western philosophy to reduce everything to the order of the same. That is, to absorb the other into my own systems of understanding and control. The face of the other breaks that attempt. It does not fit completely into my categories. It cannot be possessed. It confronts me with its nakedness and vulnerability. And in that vulnerability, there is a silent but absolute command: thou shalt not kill. This idea is decisive. For Levinas, ethics does not come from contract, calculation, or convention. It comes from the encounter with the fragility of the other. Before any theory, there is this basic call not to violate, not to destroy, not to abandon. This is where death takes on a radically ethical meaning. The mortality of the other is not only a sad fact about the world, it is what makes neutrality impossible. To see the other as mortal, exposed, and fragile is to be placed under a demand. I become responsible not because I signed a rational agreement, but because the other, in their vulnerability, has already reached me. Their possibility of suffering or dying concerns me. Human life deserves care, not in spite of its fragility, but precisely because of it. The more vulnerable it is, the more ethically urgent it becomes. This view is deeply demanding because it fights against the temptation of indifference. It is easy to philosophize about death in the abstract, turning it into an elegant topic of existential reflection. What is harder is recognizing that every human being we meet carries this essential fragility, and that this fragility involves us morally. Levinas rejects any kind of thinking that turns finitude into an intellectual spectacle. Death must be thought about through relationship. Not only I am going to die, but the other can die. The other suffers. The other also depends on my care, my justice, my refusal to harm. Ethics begins there. In Ethics and Infinity, Levinas insists that responsibility for the other is not some late addition to existence, as if I were first a complete self and only later chose, as an option, to be generous. No, responsibility comes before the sovereignty of the self. It is what constitutes me. I am called before I fully affirm myself as the center. This idea is striking because it tears down the fantasy of absolute autonomy. The subject is not only the owner of itself, free to decide whether or not to care. It is already committed, already involved, already called by the other. The death of the other makes this call even stronger because it reveals in the most extreme way the fragility of the human condition. This also changes the way we think about the fear of death. Instead of remaining trapped only in the terror of my own annihilation, Levinas opens space for an anxiety that is more ethical than ontological. What do I do with the fragility of another person? How do I respond to the exposure of the other? Am I someone who protects, welcomes, and does justice, or someone who contributes to indifference and harm? This shift is powerful because it moves the reflection away from self-preservation and toward responsibility. It does not erase personal anxiety in the face of the end, of course, but it places it within a wider horizon in which the center is not self-preservation, but care. There is something deeply human in this. In Levinas, death is not romanticized, nor dissolved into comforting theories. It remains a sign of limit, rupture, and powerlessness. But that powerlessness has ethical meaning. It reminds us that the human being is never pure strength, never invulnerable, never a substance closed in on itself. We are exposed beings, dependent beings, beings who can be affected. And that is exactly why ethics is not a luxury. It is a basic necessity. When we forget human fragility, we make room for brutality. When we recognize it, we understand why every life demands moral attention. Levinas teaches us that to think about death in a truly human way is to leave the narrow circle of exclusive concern with oneself. It is to let finitude reveal not only the limit of my existence, but the duty I have toward the existence of others. The other is mortal. The other can be wounded. The other can be reduced, ignored, discarded. And my ethical task begins when I refuse that logic. Death, then, is not only a metaphysical question about being or an existential crisis of the individual. It is also a call to care, justice, and responsibility. Maybe that is Levinas's great strength. He prevents us from thinking about finitude only as a private drama and forces us to see its moral dimension. Human life is fragile, limited, vulnerable. But that fragility does not make life less valuable. It makes it more ethically sacred, more urgent, more worthy of protection. To think about death in this way is to learn that what matters most is not only asking how I face my own end, but how I respond to the vulnerability of the other while we are still here. You are going to die may sound like a threat, but it can also work as one of the most freeing things a person can hear. Not because there is something beautiful about death itself, but because awareness of the end has the power to break a very common illusion. The idea that there will always be time later. Later, I'll change my life. Later, I'll ask for forgiveness. Later, I'll take care of my health. Later, I'll start doing what really matters. Later, I'll stop accepting what is destroying me inside. The problem is that this later often becomes the most elegant way of never truly living. Remembering that life ends can be an antidote to this postponed kind of existence. Seneca understood this with brutal clarity in On the Shortness of Life. For him, the biggest problem is not that we live too little, but that we waste too much. Life seems short because we give its best parts away to distraction, vanity, resentment, the search for approval, and activities that consume our days without feeding our soul. Seneca does not speak like someone in despair, but like someone trying to wake the reader up. Time, for him, is the most precious good because it is the only one that truly cannot be recovered. You can lose money and make it back. You can lose status and rebuild it. But a badly lived day disappears forever. And knowing that we are going to die gives weight back to that truth. That weight does not have to be dark. It can be deeply organizing. When someone remembers that they will not live forever, many confusions begin to lose their force. Small vanities shrink. Useless conflicts seem less grand. The constant need to impress other people starts to sound ridiculous. Seneca uses finitude as a practical standard. If time is limited, then I cannot spend it however I want. Death, in that sense, is not only some future biological fact. It is already working now by turning every hour into an irreversible choice. Every delay has a cost. Every escape uses up real life. Marcus Aurelius, in Meditations, turns this awareness into a daily exercise in inner discipline. He reminds himself again and again that he may leave life at any moment. But he does not do this to create fear. He does it to correct his focus. If today could be the last day, then how should I act? With pettiness? With pride? With moral laziness? With irritation over small things? For Marcus Aurelius, remembering death clears away excess noise and brings simplicity back to what matters most. It helps him ask, does this really matter? Does this deserve my energy? The answer does not come from anxiety, but from clarity. What matters tends to become more visible when time stops looking infinite. Heidegger takes this insight even further in Being and Time. For him, much of human existence happens on autopilot, inside impersonal routine, in what everyone does. A person lives according to inherited expectations, ready-made opinions, and obligations they have never truly examined. They keep pushing life forward without really taking ownership of it. That is where awareness of death enters as a break. Heidegger shows that death is not only an event that happens at the end, but a constant possibility that individualizes. No one can die for me, and because of that, no one can live for me either. When I take my finitude seriously, automatic life begins to crack. I can no longer hide so easily behind the crowd, habit, or the idea of later. That is a powerful idea. Death as a standard of authenticity. Not in the sense of making life dramatic all the time, but in the sense of asking whether I am really inhabiting my own existence. How many of my decisions are truly mine? How many of my dreams are really mine? How many habits am I keeping only out of inertia? Thinking about death may be uncomfortable, but that is exactly why it breaks the spell of existential procrastination. A postponed life depends on the fantasy of an endless supply of time. Finitude destroys that fantasy and forces a choice. Thich Nhat Hanh, by another path, offers a calmer and more contemplative way of arriving at something similar. In his teachings on mindfulness and impermanence, he invites us to look at life not with panic about the end, but with presence in the moment. Everything changes. Everything passes. The people we love will not be here forever. We will not either. This truth, instead of hardening us, can make us more attentive, more gentle, more aware. Impermanence does not have to become terror. It can become depth. A look, a meal, a simple conversation, a moment of silence. All of these gain a different kind of meaning when we stop treating them as guaranteed. There is an important difference between living while knowing that life ends and living obsessed with death. Obsession paralyzes. Clear awareness organizes. The point is not to repeat, I am going to die, like a mental threat, but to let that truth work like a filter. What remains when the unnecessary falls away? What still matters in the light of finitude? Which worries disappear? Which relationships reveal their true value? Which choices can no longer be pushed into an abstract future? That is the practical power of this thought. It does not exist only to create reflection, but to guide action. Maybe that is why it feels so uncomfortable, because many people prefer to keep life suspended, to postpone a difficult conversation, to postpone a necessary change, to postpone asking for forgiveness, to postpone leaving a routine that is already killing them inside. Postponement gives the feeling of control because it allows a person to imagine that the decision is still under their command. But in practice, it is often just cowardice disguised as caution. Death exposes this mechanism. It reminds us that the clock does not stop while we hesitate, and that life does not wait for our courage to mature comfortably. At the same time, this reminder is not meant to create a nervous rush. Not everything has to be solved today, and not every choice requires an immediate break. The standard is not hysteria, but clarity. Remembering that we are going to die does not mean living in a hurry. It means stopping the habit of living asleep. It means treating time with more respect. It means realizing that being alive is not the same as being busy. It means being present for what truly matters. It means not wasting days on what empties life. It means not sacrificing what is essential in the name of autopilot. Seneca teaches us to protect our time. Marcus Aurelius teaches us to order the soul. Heidegger teaches us to escape impersonal living. Thich Nhat Hanh teaches us to inhabit the present with gentleness. In all of them, in different ways, the same insight appears. Awareness of death can serve as a practical standard for living better. Not to make everything heavy, but to separate what is essential from what is superficial. In the end, you are going to die may be less a sentence of despair and more a call to clarity. A call to stop negotiating with your own life as if there were an endless supply of time. A call to choose more truthfully, love with more presence, speak with more honesty, and let go of what no longer deserves your days. Because remembering that life ends does not take meaning away from things. Very often, it is exactly what gives them their real value back. Remembering death is not meant to darken life, but to place it back in our hands. When you accept that time is limited, you begin to see more clearly what deserves your love, your courage, and your presence. Death stops being only a distant fear and becomes a mirror. It reveals whether you are truly living or simply postponing life. If this video spoke to you in any way, if any of these ideas made you stop, think, or look at your life more deeply, then it was already worth it for us to be here together until the end. Thank you so much for watching, for giving your time, and for sharing this reflection with me. And now I want to invite you to be part of this journey here on the channel. Subscribe so you do not miss the next videos, because we still have many deep reflections ahead. Leave a like, because that really helps the channel reach more people. Share this video with someone who may also need to hear this message. And of course, write in the comments, which of these ideas stayed with you the most? Which philosopher or view of death affected you the most? And do not leave the channel just yet. Stay here and keep watching the next videos, because this may be exactly the conversation you needed to have at this moment in your life.